In August 2013, a dog walker made a grim discovery in the Wicklow Mountains of Ireland. What appeared to be human remains would lead investigators on a chilling journey into a world of dark fantasies, digital evidence, and a case that would change Irish law forever. This is the story of Graham Dwyer, a successful architect whose double life would shock a nation. It's a case that raises disturbing questions about the masks people wear, the vulnerability of those struggling with mental health, and how far technology can reach into our private lives in the pursuit of justice. Before we begin, a content warning. This video discusses a real murder case involving violence and disturbing content. Viewer discretion is advised. To understand this case, we need to understand Elaine O'Hara. She wasn't just a victim, she was a real person, with hopes, struggles, and a life that mattered. Elaine was born in 1976 and grew up in South Dublin. By all accounts, she had a difficult childhood and adolescence. She struggled with her mental health from a young age, experiencing severe depression and emotional difficulties that would follow her throughout her life. As an adult, Elaine worked as a childcare assistant. Those who knew her professionally described her as caring and gentle with children, though she often seemed lonely and isolated. She had been in and out of psychiatric care throughout her 20s and 30s and had made several suicide attempts in the past. Elaine lived alone in an apartment in Killiney, a coastal suburb of Dublin. She had few close friends and often struggled with feelings of worthlessness and isolation. Her therapists and medical records would later reveal that she desperately wanted to be loved and accepted, a vulnerability that would tragically be exploited. In her 30s, Elaine began exploring online communities, looking for connection and perhaps escape from her loneliness. She visited BDSM websites and chat rooms, seeking relationships and experiences that might make her feel wanted. This search for connection would lead her to the man who would kill her. By 2008, Elaine had met someone online who called himself Master. Their relationship would span several years, growing progressively darker and more dangerous. But we'll come back to that. The 22nd of August 2012 started as an ordinary day, but it would be the last time anyone saw Elaine O'Hara alive. That morning, Elaine had an appointment at St. Edmundsbury Hospital in Lucan, where she had been receiving psychiatric care. She attended her session, and staff noted nothing unusual about her demeanor or state of mind. After her appointment, she left the hospital. Later that day, Elaine's car, a white Fiat Punto, was found abandoned near Shanganagh Cemetery in South Dublin, close to the seafront. Her keys were discovered at the nearby coastal area. When she didn't return home and didn't show up for work, concerned friends and family reported her missing. Given Elaine's history of mental health struggles and previous suicide attempts, the initial investigation focused on the possibility that she had taken her own life. The location where her car was found, near the sea, seemed to support this theory. Searches were conducted along the coastline, but no body was recovered. Weeks turned into months. Elaine's family held out hope, but as time passed, the likelihood of finding her alive diminished. Her bank accounts remained untouched. Her phone was silent. It was as if she had simply vanished. The case went cold. Elaine O'Hara became another missing person statistic, her face on posters, her family left in agonizing limbo. For nearly a year, there were no answers, no closure, no leads. But in September 2013, that would all change. Almost exactly 1 year after Elaine's disappearance, a dog walker was hiking in the Killickey area of the Dublin Mountains, in the foothills of the Wicklow Mountains. The area is popular with hikers and dog walkers, offering stunning views of Dublin and the Irish Sea. But on this day, the walkers stumbled upon something horrifying: scattered human remains. Gardaí, the Irish police, were immediately called to the scene. The remains were skeletal, scattered across a wooded area. A year of exposure to the elements, along with animal interference, had made identification extremely difficult. The location was remote, accessible by hiking trails and forest paths, the kind of place where someone might dispose of a body, hoping it would never be found. As forensic teams combed the area, they made several crucial discoveries. Scattered near the remains were items of clothing, women's clothing, that would later be matched to items Elaine O'Hara owned. There were also personal effects, and most importantly, several pieces of evidence that seemed out of place in such a remote, natural setting. Investigators found handcuffs, chains, and restraints. They discovered a folding knife, and they found other items that seemed to tell a dark story about what had happened in this isolated spot. But the most significant discovery was yet to come, and it wouldn't happen in the mountains at all. Around the same time, about 10 miles away at the Reservoir in County Wicklow, something unusual was happening. Ireland had experienced an unusually dry summer in 2013, and water levels at the reservoir had dropped significantly. As the water receded, it revealed items that had been submerged and hidden for a year. Among the objects that emerged were 2 mobile phones. These phones had been underwater for approximately 12 months. By all rights, they should have been completely destroyed. But modern smartphones are surprisingly resilient, and the data storage within them even more so. When these phones were recovered and sent to the Garda Technical Bureau for analysis, they still contained data, and that data would break the case wide open. The phones contained thousands of text messages, revealing a relationship between Elaine O'Hara and a man who used burner phones and went by names like Master and Sir. What investigators found in those recovered phones was deeply disturbing. The text messages painted a picture of a relationship that had begun years earlier, around 2008 or 2009. The correspondence showed that Elaine had been involved in what appeared to be a BDSM relationship with a man who was dominant and controlling. But as investigators read through the thousands of messages, it became clear this went far beyond consensual kink. The messages discussed extreme violence. They talked about stabbing. They contained detailed fantasies about causing serious harm and even killing. In one exchange, the man wrote about wanting to stab someone during sex. In another, he discussed finding a victim who wouldn't be missed. The messages made references to going all the way and not stopping. Elaine's responses to these messages were complex. Sometimes she seemed willing, at other times reluctant or scared. The messages revealed her desperation for affection and acceptance, and how that desperation was being exploited. It appeared that the man was pushing boundaries further and further, testing how far Elaine would go to please him. The final messages were the most chilling. On the 22nd of August 2012, the day Elaine disappeared, there were texts arranging a meeting. The location mentioned was near the Dublin Mountains. The man's final message to Elaine was sent in the early afternoon. Elaine's phone stopped transmitting shortly after. Now the question became, who was this man? Who was Master? The phones recovered from the reservoir were examined thoroughly. One belonged to Elaine, her known mobile number. The other was a cheap, prepaid phone, the kind often called a burner phone because it's used temporarily and then disposed of. But even burner phones leave traces. When investigators examined the call records and location data associated with this second phone, they made a breakthrough. The phone had been in contact with another number, also a prepaid phone, but one that had made calls to identifiable people. Following this digital trail, investigators identified a name, Graham Dwyer. Graham Dwyer was 42 years old when investigators came knocking on his door. On the surface, he seemed to have an enviable life. Born in 1970, Dwyer had grown up in Dublin and attended a good school. He studied architecture at the Dublin Institute of Technology and had built a successful career. By 2012, he was working as an architect for A&D Wagert and Partners, a prominent Dublin architecture firm. His projects included designing buildings and working on significant developments around Ireland. He lived in Foxrock, one of Dublin's most affluent suburbs, in a large house worth well over €500,000. He was married to Gemma Dwyer, and they had 2 children together. He drove a nice car, took family vacations, and attended school events. To neighbors and colleagues, he was just another successful professional, living a comfortable suburban life. But Graham Dwyer had secrets. When investigators began digging into his background, A different picture emerged. Dwyer had been active on alternative lifestyle websites for years. He frequented BDSM sites and chat rooms, using various online personas. He had profiles on fetish websites where he described himself as a dominant sadist interested in extreme activities. Multiple women came forward after his arrest, saying they had been involved with Dwyer. Their accounts painted a disturbing picture. Several described experiences where Dwyer had pushed boundaries without consent, becoming aggressive and frightening. Some said he had a fixation on knives and cutting. Others described scenarios where he had discussed fantasies about stabbing and killing. One former partner provided particularly damning evidence. She had video footage that Dwyer himself had recorded. In these videos, Dwyer could be seen engaging in knife play with her, holding blades to her throat while becoming sexually aroused. The woman's face showed fear, even as Dwyer appeared excited. When investigators searched Dwyer's home, office, and vehicles, they found more evidence of his double life. Hidden among his possessions were items that didn't fit with his family man image: restraints, knives, and a collection of items that prosecutors would later call a kill kit. On his computers and devices, forensic analysts found extensive search histories that revealed an obsession with violence against women. He had searched for terms like killing women, knife to throat, getting away with murder, buying a body, and chest wounds. He had visited websites about serial killers and violent crimes. He had downloaded images and videos depicting violence against women. But perhaps most damning was the digital trail that connected him directly to Elaine O'Hara. The investigation into Graham Dwyer became one of the most technically complex murder cases in Irish history. At the center of the case was digital evidence: phone records, location data, text messages, internet searches, and metadata. In 2013, using this type of evidence to prove murder was still relatively new territory, especially in Ireland. Investigators worked with telecommunications companies to obtain detailed records. What they pieced together was extraordinarily damning. The location data from the burner phones showed that they had traveled together on multiple occasions, from Dublin to the mountains, following routes that matched where Elaine's remains and personal effects were found. The phones had been in the same locations at the same times, over and over again. On the 22nd of August 2012, the day Elaine disappeared, location data showed both phones traveling to the Killikee area, where her remains would later be discovered. The phones stayed in that area for several hours in the afternoon. Then, only one phone, the one linked to Dwyer, left the area. Elaine's phone went silent. But the digital evidence went further. Investigators traced the purchase of the burner phones. They found that prepaid phone credit had been purchased using loyalty cards that were registered to Graham Dwyer. They examined CCTV footage from stores where phones and phone credit had been purchased. While the footage was grainy, analysts believed they could identify Dwyer making these purchases. Physical evidence also connected Dwyer to the crime. The restraints found near Elaine's remains matched restraints found in Dwyer's possession. The knife discovered at the scene was consistent with knives Dwyer owned. Forensic analysis of Dwyer's car revealed traces of Elaine's blood, though the defense would later dispute this finding. Perhaps most significantly, investigators found that Dwyer had researched how to hide his digital tracks. He had searched for information about how phone tracking works, how to avoid leaving evidence, and how investigations are conducted. This consciousness of guilt would be powerful evidence at trial. The Irish Director of Public Prosecutions made the decision. Graham Dwyer would be charged with the murder of Elaine O'Hara. He was arrested on the 17th of October 2013 and formally charged the following day. The arrest made immediate headlines across Ireland. Graham Dwyer's trial began on the 27th of January 2015 at the Central Criminal Court in Dublin. It would last 9 weeks and become one of the most closely watched trials in modern Irish history. The prosecution was led by senior counsel Sean Guerin. His task was to convince the jury that Dwyer had deliberately murdered Elaine O'Hara, exploiting her vulnerability to live out his violent fantasies. Dwyer pleaded not guilty. The prosecution's case was meticulous and comprehensive. Over the course of the trial, they called dozens of witnesses and presented hundreds of pieces of evidence. The text messages were read out in court, day after day. The jury heard Elaine's voice through these messages, sometimes eager to please, sometimes uncertain, sometimes expressing fear. They heard Master's voice too, controlling, pushing boundaries, discussing violence in increasingly explicit terms. Former partners of Dwyer testified, describing his obsession with knives and violence. One woman broke down as she described her experiences with him, how he had frightened her, how he had become aroused by holding a knife to her throat. The video evidence was shown, footage of Dwyer engaging in knife play, his face visible, his excitement obvious. It was powerful evidence that this wasn't just fantasy for him. He acted on these urges. Telecommunications experts testified about the phone records and location data. Using detailed charts and maps, they showed the jury how the phones had moved together, how they had been in the mountains on the day Elaine died, how one came back and one didn't. Forensic analysts explained how they had extracted data from waterlogged phones. Computer forensics experts walked the jury through Dwyer's search histories, his visits to violent websites, his research into covering his tracks. The physical evidence was presented, the restraints, the knives, the items found both at the scene and in Dwyer's possession. Medical evidence established that Elaine had died from a stab wound to the chest. The pathologist explained that the wound would have required significant force, that it had penetrated the heart, that death would not have been instantaneous, but would have come within minutes. The prosecution argued that Dwyer had groomed Elaine over years, gradually escalating the violence, testing her boundaries, exploiting her mental health struggles, and desperate need for connection. They argued that he had carefully planned her murder, using burner phones to avoid detection, choosing a remote location, and attempting to dispose of evidence by throwing the phones into the reservoir. The defense, led by senior counsel Remy Farrell, faced an uphill battle. Their strategy was to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the relationship had been consensual, and that Elaine might have taken her own life. They pointed to Elaine's history of suicide attempts. They suggested that the text messages might have been role play or fantasy, not genuine intentions. They questioned the reliability of the digital evidence and challenged the forensic findings. The defense argued that there was no direct evidence placing Dwyer at the scene of the murder. No witnesses saw them together that day. No murder weapon was definitively linked to him. The blood evidence in his car was disputed. They suggested that Elaine, struggling with her mental health and perhaps feeling used or discarded, might have gone to the mountains and taken her own life, and that Dwyer had panicked when he heard she was missing, disposing of the phones because he feared the relationship would be exposed. It was a creative defense, but the weight of evidence against it was enormous. The prosecution's closing arguments were devastating. They methodically walked through the evidence, piece by piece, showing how it all fit together into an inescapable conclusion. Graham Dwyer had murdered Elaine O'Hara. They addressed the defense's suicide theory directly. If Elaine had killed herself, why would Dwyer dispose of the phones? Why would he have researched murder and killing in the weeks before her death? Why would the text messages discuss him stabbing her? Why would his phone have been in the mountains at the exact location where her body was found? The jury retired to deliberate on the 27th of March 2015. After just over 7 hours of deliberations, they returned with their verdict: guilty of murder. Graham Dwyer showed little emotion as the verdict was read. In the public gallery, Elaine's family wept with relief. On the 20th of April 2015, Dwyer was sentenced to life in prison, with the judge describing the murder as calculated and planned, and noting that Dwyer had shown no remorse. But the story didn't end there. The Dwyer case was about to create a legal earthquake in Ireland. Graham Dwyer may have been convicted, but his legal team wasn't finished. They immediately filed appeals, and at the center of their appeals was a question that would have massive implications. Was the phone data used to convict him legally obtained? In Ireland, as in much of Europe, telecommunications companies were required by law to retain customer data phone records, location information, text message logs for extended periods. This data retention was ostensibly for national security and serious crime investigation. Dwyer's lawyers argued that this blanket data retention violated his right to privacy under European law, specifically the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. They cited a European Court of Justice ruling from 2014 that had struck down an EU-wide data retention directive. In April 2018, the Irish High Court agreed with Dwyer. Justice Tony O'Connor ruled that Irish law requiring blanket retention of phone data was unconstitutional because it violated privacy rights. The law, he said, didn't have sufficient safeguards and wasn't limited to serious crimes. This ruling created a crisis. If the data retention was illegal, what happened to Dwyer's conviction? More importantly, what happened to the hundreds of other criminal cases in Ireland that had relied on similar data? The Irish government appealed the decision, but they also scrambled to pass new legislation. In 2018, Ireland enacted the Communications Retention of Data Act, which created a more limited and targeted system for data retention, with judicial oversight. Meanwhile, Dwyer's case went to Ireland's Court of Appeal. In 2020, the Court of Appeal upheld his conviction, but for nuanced reasons. They ruled that yes, the blanket data retention had been unlawful. However, they found that excluding the phone data from Dwyer's trial would be disproportionate given the seriousness of the crime. The court essentially said, even though the data collection method was wrong, using that data to solve a murder was the right thing to do, and excluding it would be a greater injustice than the privacy violation. This was a delicate balancing act, acknowledging the privacy violation while still allowing the conviction to stand. The judges noted that Dwyer could have had no legitimate expectation of privacy in planning and carrying out a murder. Dwyer's team took the case to Ireland's Supreme Court, the final level of appeal. In November 2020, the Supreme Court handed down its decision. Graham Dwyer's murder conviction would stand. The Supreme Court's ruling was complex. They acknowledged that the data retention regime had been problematic and probably violated EU law. However, they ruled that Irish courts had the discretion to admit evidence even if it was obtained in violation of data protection laws, particularly in serious cases like murder. They also noted that much of the evidence against Dwyer didn't come from the blanket data retention. The text messages themselves, the videos, the search histories, the physical evidence, all of that was independently admissible. The Supreme Court's message was clear. While data protection and privacy rights are important, they must be balanced against the public interest in solving serious crimes. A technical violation of data retention laws could not be allowed to let a murderer walk free when the evidence of his guilt was overwhelming. The Graham Dwyer case changed Ireland forever, in multiple ways. First, it transformed Irish criminal law and procedure. The case demonstrated the power of digital forensics in solving crimes. It showed how location data, metadata, and digital communications could reconstruct events and prove guilt, even without traditional evidence like eyewitnesses or DNA. Since the Dwyer trial, digital evidence has become central to criminal investigations in Ireland and worldwide. Prosecutors now routinely use phone records, computer forensics, and data analysis to build cases. Defense attorneys have had to develop expertise in challenging this evidence. The case also forced Ireland to confront difficult questions about privacy versus security. The legal battle over data retention sparked a national conversation about how much surveillance should be acceptable in a free society. Where's the line between protecting citizens from crime and protecting citizens from intrusive government monitoring? The new data retention legislation passed after Dwyer's challenge was more restrictive and targeted than the old system. It included judicial oversight, limited the types of crimes for which data could be accessed, and created safeguards for privacy. This represented a real shift in how Ireland balances these competing interests. But perhaps the most important impact of the Dwyer case was how it illuminated the dangers of online exploitation and the vulnerability of people struggling with mental health issues. Elaine O'Hara was not a naive teenager. She was a 6-year-old woman. But she was lonely, struggling, and desperately seeking connection. Dwyer identified these vulnerabilities and exploited them ruthlessly. The case highlighted how online spaces, including alternative lifestyle communities, can be hunting grounds for predators. It showed how gradually escalating behavior can be used to normalize abuse. It demonstrated how someone can be groomed and manipulated over years. In the aftermath of the trial, mental health organizations in Ireland spoke about the need for better support systems for vulnerable adults. They emphasized that people struggling with mental health issues are at higher risk of exploitation and need protection and resources. The case also prompted discussions in BDSM and kink communities about consent, safety, and red flags. Many in these communities emphasized that what Dwyer did was not BDSM, it was abuse hiding behind the language of kink. They talked about the importance of genuine consent, safe words, and respecting boundaries, all things that were absent in Dwyer's treatment of Elaine. Graham Dwyer is currently serving his life sentence at the Midlands Prison in County Louth, Ireland. Under Irish law, a life sentence means imprisonment for life, though prisoners can apply for parole after serving a minimum term. Dwyer has never admitted guilt. He has never shown remorse. According to reports from prison sources, he has never expressed any sympathy for Elaine O'Hara or her family. He continues to maintain his innocence and has reportedly told other inmates that he was wrongly convicted. Prison officials have described him as a model prisoner who keeps to himself and causes no trouble, but who remains in denial about his crime. His wife, Gemma Dwyer, divorced him after his conviction. She has maintained a dignified silence and avoided media attention, focusing on raising their 2 children away from the shadow of their father's crimes. The children's identities have been protected, and they are now teenagers trying to build lives separate from their father's infamy. Elaine O'Hara's family has also largely stayed out of the public eye since the trial ended. Her father, Frank O'Hara, spoke briefly after the verdict, saying that while nothing could bring Elaine back, they were relieved that justice had been served. The family has worked to preserve Elaine's memory, not as a victim, but as a person, a woman who loved children, who struggled bravely with mental illness, and who deserved so much better than what happened to her. In 2019, Elaine's sister gave a brief interview in which she talked about the family's ongoing grief and the difficulty of having such a private tragedy become so public. She spoke about wishing people remembered Elaine's kindness and gentleness, not just the circumstances of her death. The case left scars on many others too. The women who testified about their experiences with Dwyer showed tremendous courage, but speaking publicly about such traumatic experiences took its toll. Several have spoken about struggling with guilt, wondering if they could have done something to prevent Elaine's death, if they had reported Dwyer's behavior earlier. The investigation team who worked the case, Gardaí, forensic analysts, prosecutors, have described it as one of the most difficult of their careers, not just technically, but emotionally. Reading those text messages, seeing the evidence of how Elaine was manipulated and groomed, understanding how her vulnerability was weaponized against her, it affected everyone involved. Thank you for watching to the end. Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more stories like this. Thank you.